Hannah Cooper was the kind of 18-year-old who made people feel calmer just by standing near her. She didn't chase attention, didn't run with crowds, didn't stir up noise. She carried quiet talent in her hands. Sketches of Lake Superior, portraits of neighbors, tiny drawings on napkins she left for customers at the cafe where she worked evenings. People saved those napkins. They said her drawings felt like tiny pieces of hope in a town that could be cold in more ways than one. Her mother used to say Hannah had an old soul, not a sad one, just thoughtful. A girl who paid attention to the things most people rushed past. She cared about her friends, cared about her community, and cared about getting home on time so her mom wouldn't worry. That's who she was. Reliable, soft-spoken. A light people didn't realize they depended on until it was gone. March of 1974 had been rough on Duluth. Snowbanks hardened into walls along the streets, and wind sliced through coats like it knew exactly where people were weakest. But Hannah never complained. She wrapped her scarf twice, packed her sketchbook, and walked to her shift at the Lakeside Cafe the same way she always did. Steady, careful, never imagining she wouldn't return along that same path. That evening, she clocked out just after 8:40 p.m. She left behind half-finished drawings taped to the corkboard in the kitchen, telling her coworkers she'd finish them tomorrow. Tomorrow. That word would haunt every person in that cafe for the rest of their lives. Her coworker offered her a ride home, but she declined with her usual gentle smile. "It's okay, it's only 10 minutes. 10 minutes, just 10. Every parent in Duluth would repeat that number for decades. 10 minutes between safety and a nightmare that would swallow their town whole. For Hannah, it was just the usual routine. Coat zipped, bag slung over her shoulder, boots crunching on icy pavement as she stepped into the cold night air. She didn't know she had just taken her last steps under the glow of the cafe sign. She didn't know someone was waiting. She didn't know those 10 minutes would become the story people whispered about long after her name stopped appearing in newspapers. She never made it home. And that truth would turn Duluth into a place that no longer trusted its own streets. Hannah's walk home should have been simple. A straight path, a familiar bus stop, houses she passed every night without thinking twice. Duluth wasn't loud or chaotic back then. It was the kind of town where people believed danger lived somewhere else, far away. Not here, not on these quiet, frozen streets. But trust is fragile, and that night it shattered without warning. She left the cafe at 8:42 p.m. At 8:47, her brother tried calling to ask if she needed a ride. Hannah never answered. That alone was strange. Hannah always called back. Always. Her mother tried again. No answer. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe the wind drowning out the ring. Maybe Hannah's gloved hands moving too slowly. But deep down, something in her chest tightened. A pressure she couldn't name yet. At 8:55 p.m., a driver passing the bus stop noticed something lying near the bench. A notebook, pages bent from the wet ground, as if it had been dropped mid-movement. He didn't think much of it. Young people dropped things all the time. He didn't know that the name on the inside cover would stop a mother's heart cold. By 9:10 p.m., the temperature dropped again, turning breath into fog. That's when a teenager walking his dog spotted a long scarf half buried in snow beside the sidewalk. Torn at the end, threads stretched like they had been pulled instead of ripped clean. He picked it up, shook the snow off, and placed it on the bench, thinking someone would come back for it. No one came back. At 9:27 p.m., Hannah's mother stepped out onto the porch, phone still in her shaking hand. She stared at the empty street, listening for footsteps that never came. She kept telling herself, she's late, that's all. She's just late. But fear doesn't care about reason. It grows its own roots. By 9:40 p.m., her father took the car and drove the entire route, headlights sweeping across snowbanks, mailbox posts, and empty driveways. No movement, no sign of his daughter. Only silence tightening around him the longer he searched. At 10:12 p.m., he found the notebook. At 10:19 pumpkin, he found the scarf. By 10:24 p.m., he called home, and his voice broke before he could finish the sentence. She's not on the road. And that was the moment Duluth changed. Not officially, not publicly, but quietly, in the space between a mother's heartbeat and the cold air pressing against her lungs. She called the police at 10:28 p.m. The dispatcher asked routine questions, but to a mother trying to hold herself together, every question felt like a blade. When did you last see her? Is she usually late? Could she be with friends? No, no, no. Hannah wasn't the type to disappear. She wasn't the type to wander. She wasn't the type to leave her belongings scattered like a trail of panic behind her. Something had happened. Something close. Something fast. Duluth just didn't know it yet. Hannah's mother didn't wait by the phone. She stood at the window, hands pressed against the cold glass, staring down the street as if she could pull her daughter home with sheer will. Every passing second stretched into something unbearable. Fear has a way of turning minutes into punishment. Her father burst through the door at 10:31 p.m., snow in his hair, breath broken, eyes already holding the truth he didn't want to speak. He dropped Hannah's torn scarf on the kitchen table. Her mother let out a sound no home should ever hear. Not anger, not confusion, but grief born too early. By 10:40 p.m., the first patrol car rolled up, lights silent to avoid alarming neighbors. But the quiet was worse. Officers stepped out slowly, like they were entering a tragedy they couldn't undo. They asked for the timeline. They asked for details. They asked for anything that might turn the nightmare into a misunderstanding. There was nothing, just a missing girl, a torn scarf, a notebook filled with sketches she'd never finish. Neighbors gathered on porches, wrapped in coats, watching with wide eyes. Some whispered, some prayed, some avoided looking at Hannah's parents at all. Because if this could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. The officers split up, walking the route with flashlights cutting through the dark. They searched ditches, front yards, alleys, even under porches. Every beam of light returned empty. Every minute that passed weighed heavier on the family, crushing hope beneath the cold night air. At 11:18 p.m., one officer radioed in, "Nothing yet." At 11:47 p.m., still nothing. By midnight, Duluth was awake. Curtains shifted as people peeked outside. Cars moved slowly through intersections. Everyone sensed the shift, the feeling that the world had tilted. At 12:14 a.m., Hannah's mother whispered the sentence she'd been choking back for the last 3 hours. Something took her. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't panic. It was instinct, the kind only a mother has. The police tried to reassure her, but their eyes gave them away. They knew the clock was already working against them. At 1:14 a.m., her disappearance was officially logged. The search had begun, but the town had already lost something it would never get back. That night didn't just take Hannah, it fractured Duluth's sense of safety. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The morning after Hannah vanished, Duluth woke up frozen in more ways than one. Snow still clung to rooftops, but the real cold came from the fear spreading across the city. Patrol cars parked along 6th Avenue, radios hissing through the quiet, officers stepping through drifts that swallowed their boots. They were trying, anyone could see that, but the truth hung in the air like frost. They were already behind. Detective Warren McKinley arrived just before sunrise, shoulders tense, jaw locked. He'd seen awful cases before, but something about this one got under his skin fast. Maybe it was Hannah's age. Maybe it was her parents' faces, hollowed out, begging for a miracle no one could promise. He looked at the scarf, the notebook, the footprints erased by overnight snowfall, and his expression shifted. He knew the storm had stolen half their clues before they even started. Officers canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking the same desperate questions again and again. But every answer contradicted the last. One neighbor said they saw a dark truck. Another claimed an older man passed by moments earlier. A third insisted there was no one on the street at all. It wasn't evidence, it was noise. Time was slipping, and the leads were already thinning out. Detective McKinley questioned Hannah's coworkers at the cafe. A few cried. One blamed herself for not walking Hannah to the bus stop. A manager insisted Hannah left alone, but a cook said he saw a figure waiting near the corner. McKinley pressed him for details, but the man's story changed twice within a single sentence. Every minute wasted felt like betrayal. By noon, the detectives had three possible suspects: a coworker who walked home at the same time, a neighbor who owned a truck similar to the one mentioned, a driver passing through who never stopped to speak with police. All three fell apart in under an hour. The coworker had a solid alibi. The neighbor's truck was wrong. The driver was tracked down. He'd been delivering newspapers. Nothing held. Everything slipped. Back at the Carter house, Miriam refused to sit. She marched room to room, demanding updates from officers, insisting they check alleys, sheds, garages, every frozen corner of the city. Her voice cracked from pleading, but she wasn't apologizing for pushing them. She was a mother, and mothers don't surrender. Officers tried to reassure her, but reassurance felt like lying. The clock was louder than their words. Rumors swirled across town before sunset. Some blamed strangers, others blamed the police. Some pointed fingers at anyone who didn't look familiar enough. Fear had turned the city into a powder keg, one spark away from burning itself down. By the second evening, McKinley realized the case was slipping through his fingers. Snow had swallowed prints. Witnesses contradicted each other. Leads dried up as fast as they appeared. Every dead end weighed heavier on his shoulders. When Miriam confronted him on her porch, voice shaking with rage and heartbreak, he didn't look away. He let her scream, let her curse the sky, let her blame him for not moving mountains. Because deep down, he blamed himself too. And through all of it, one question lingered in the frozen air. A question no one dared to answer. Would you still fight for someone if the world stopped listening? By the third day, the investigation wasn't just struggling. It was cracking under the weight of chaos. Duluth had turned jumpy, suspicious, unsettled. People whispered Hannah's name like it carried a curse. Every shadow on the corner became a suspect. Every parked car became a threat. And every hour that passed made the truth feel farther away. Detective McKinley tried to steady his team, but even he couldn't hide the tension tightening around the department. Calls poured in nonstop, some helpful, most useless. One man claimed he saw Hannah boarding a bus heading north. Another insisted she'd been at a gas station miles away. A woman swore she heard a scream near the waterfront, only to later admit it was a fox in her trash cans. Noise. More noise. Nothing real, nothing solid. But the worst blow came late that afternoon. A patrol officer delivered news McKinley didn't want to hear. Some of the early evidence had been mishandled. Not destroyed, just stored the wrong way. But wrong was enough to damage the chain of custody. Wrong was enough to weaken everything. McKinley felt his stomach drop. He knew what this meant. Defense attorneys could destroy the case before it even began. And if the wrong person ever sat in the interrogation chair, the department would take the fall. Not the predator who stole Hannah. When Miriam arrived at the station demanding answers, every officer in the room froze. She didn't scream this time. She didn't cry. She stood there, hands trembling, voice barely above a whisper. Is my daughter still out there? Or did you lose her again? No one could answer. McKinley stepped forward, trying to hold himself steady. We're still working, ma'am. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't comfort either. Miriam stared at him like she was staring through him, through the walls, through the uniforms, through the thin veil of hope she'd been clinging to. Outside, the city grew colder. Snow drifted down in soft sheets, covering the sidewalks where Hannah once walked, covering the bus stop where her notebook was found, covering any last footprint that might have mattered. The case wasn't closing. It was suffocating. By the end of the week, Duluth was holding its breath. At first, everyone wanted to help. People formed search groups. Churches opened doors for volunteers. Neighbors shared flashlights and thermoses of weak coffee to keep the cold away. Every block echoed with voices calling Hannah's name. It felt like the town had united for one purpose: to bring her home. But unity doesn't survive fear for long. When the leads collapsed and the police admitted they had no solid direction, something in the community shifted. The support that once filled sidewalks and parking lots began thinning out. Whispered theories replaced teamwork. Instead of searching together, people started watching each other, waiting for someone to slip, someone to reveal a truth they didn't even have. Parents kept their children inside. Strangers avoided eye contact. Local businesses stopped putting up missing posters, not because they didn't care, but because they were tired of feeling powerless every time they saw her face. Fear is loud at first, then it becomes quiet in the worst way. Miriam noticed it before anyone else. The casseroles stopped coming. The phone calls slowed. The neighbors who once promised to help in any way possible began closing their curtains. People acted as if staying silent would keep them safe. One night, Miriam stood in her doorway watching the search teams disperse earlier than usual. She whispered into the cold air, "Please don't forget her." The wind carried her words away like they weighed nothing. The next morning, only 6 volunteers showed up. By the weekend, there were 2. A week later, none. Duluth hadn't stopped caring. It had simply run out of courage. Detective McKinley wrote in his notebook that night, "The city is retreating." And he was right. The investigation wasn't the only thing dying in the snow. Hope was thinning with it. While Duluth went quiet, Miriam refused to sit still. She showed up at the police station every morning, not yelling, not begging, just standing at the front desk until someone acknowledged her. Officers began avoiding the lobby because they couldn't bear the look in her eyes, a mixture of hope, grief, and exhaustion that no one knew how to soothe. She brought handwritten lists of questions she wanted answered. Did you check the trail behind the cafe again? Did anyone follow up with the driver who stopped on 3rd Street? Did you search the old storage yard by the docks? Most of the time, the officers didn't know what to say. Other times, they pretended they were working on it, even when they weren't. Miriam wasn't naive. She knew when she was being brushed aside. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she stopped pushing, the world would stop too. Detective McKinley grew to respect her more than he admitted. He once told a colleague, "She's doing half the work this department should have done." But respect didn't bring results. And every day ended the same way, with Miriam walking down the snowy steps alone, her footprints the only proof she'd been there. At home, her husband tried to stay strong, but grief hollowed him out faster than he could hide it. He stopped attending the meetings with police. He couldn't stand hearing phrases like lack of evidence or no new leads. He sat in Hannah's room for hours at a time, sometimes holding her favorite sweater like it still held warmth. Miriam did the opposite. She went out into the world again and again, knocking on doors, posting flyers, searching every alley, every abandoned lot, every trail. She wore through 2 pairs of boots in a single winter. One night at 3 in the morning, she walked into the cold with Hannah's scarf wrapped around her own shoulders. A neighbor watching from his window whispered to his wife, "She's going to break." But she didn't. Grief didn't crush her. It sharpened her. When everyone else stopped looking, she kept going. When everyone else stepped back, she stepped forward. Her resolve terrified the officers because her dedication only reminded them of their failures. And every time they tried to reassure her, she'd answer with the same quiet sentence, "You don't stop until she's found." It became her vow, her identity, her reason to wake up. And it was the one thing the investigation could never match. By March of 1975, something happened that Miriam feared more than anything else. People stopped talking about Hannah. The flyers that once covered every doorway were replaced with store ads and lost pet posters. The neighbors who used to bring casseroles now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. The town that had once shouted Hannah's name now treated it like a burden. Inside the police station, the tone shifted too. Detective McKinley was reassigned to a robbery case. The task force created for Hannah lasted only 8 weeks. The evidence cabinet swallowed her file like it was nothing more than another stack of paper. The officers didn't say the words out loud, but Miriam heard them anyway. "We're done." When she visited the station after 2 days of no updates, a young officer, new, nervous, and reading from a script, told her, "Ma'am, we've exhausted all leads." Exhausted leads. As if her daughter's life was something that could be checked off and moved on from. Miriam didn't argue. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just looked at him. That long, steady stare. The stare of a mother who has reached the point where pain and rage overlap. Then she turned and walked out. That night, she sat at Hannah's desk, staring at the empty chair, at the unfinished sketch lying there, a drawing Hannah never got to complete. The eraser marks, the faint pencil smudges, all of it froze Miriam in place. Her husband placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "We can't keep doing this." She didn't look up when she answered, "I don't know how to stop." And the truth was, she didn't want to, because stopping meant admitting the world had abandoned Hannah, and Miriam refused to be part of that betrayal. The police ended their search, the community moved on, but Miriam didn't. She couldn't. What the world forgot, she would remember. What the system ignored, she would fight for. What the snow buried, she would dig through with her bare hands if she had to. And in that quiet, frozen house, one thing became certain. The case had died, but her determination had just begun. By the start of summer, the case didn't just stall, it fell apart in slow, painful pieces. The final blow came during a cramped afternoon meeting at the Duluth Police Department. A supervisor, juggling 4 other cases, made the announcement in under 30 seconds. Hannah Cooper's case will remain open, but active investigation is suspended. Suspended. A word that felt colder than the winter she vanished in. Detective McKinley lowered his eyes. Detective Harris clenched his jaw. But neither of them stood up. Neither argued. Neither said, "No, we keep going." It was over. Every unanswered call, every ignored lead, every hour Miriam begged them to look again at the bus stop, the lakefront, the service road behind the cafe. All of it ended with a single signature and a folder slid onto a shelf. Hannah's file joined hundreds of others, a quiet graveyard of names that never found their way home. When Miriam arrived at the station the next day, no one told her directly. She found out by watching the way officers avoided her eyes, how they suddenly used phrases like limited manpower and ongoing priorities. She stepped outside into the parking lot, the air sharp and unfriendly, and leaned against her car as her breath shook. A mother shouldn't have to fight this hard for her own child. She shouldn't have to beg for the bare minimum: effort, attention, humanity. Yet here she was, alone, again. That night, snow started falling even though the forecast promised clear skies. Miriam stood at the doorway watching the flakes collect on the porch railing. Something inside her cracked. Not loud, not dramatic, but quietly, the way ice breaks under pressure. She whispered into the empty night, "They've stopped looking for you, but I won't." And so the investigation ended, not with a final discovery, not with justice, but with a mother standing in the cold, her voice trembling, clinging to the only thing she had left, hope that refused to shut its eyes. The year after the investigation collapsed felt colder than the winter Hannah vanished. Miriam moved through her days like someone carrying an invisible weight on her chest, one that never loosened, never shifted, never gave her a moment to breathe. Every corner of the house reminded her of what she'd lost: the empty seat at the dinner table, the coat still hanging by the door, the bedroom she couldn't bring herself to change. People in Duluth meant well at first. They brought dinners, they shared prayers, they offered rides. But as weeks turned to months and months turned into the next year, the kindness thinned, the casseroles stopped, the comforting words faded into awkward nods. Conversations shifted when she walked into a room. It wasn't cruelty, it was exhaustion, the kind people feel when faced with a grief they cannot fix. But Miriam didn't let silence pull her under. Every January, she went back to the Duluth Police Department, standing at the same front desk with the same trembling hands, asking the same question. Is there anything new? The faces behind the counter changed. Younger officers, older officers, officers who barely glanced at the file before giving the same answer. No updates, ma'am. By 19 then, they didn't bother pretending they were still searching. By 1979, some officers spoke to her with the tone used for impossible cases. By 1980, one officer gently suggested she learn to let go. She didn't speak to him again. Instead, she made a small ritual. Every Sunday morning, she walked to the bus stop where Hannah's notebook had been found. She placed a white flower at the base of the signpost. Rain washed some away, snow buried others. But Miriam never missed a week. The world kept moving, new stores opening, new families arriving, the city expanding toward the lake. But her routine stayed frozen in place, a reminder that grief had its own clock, and hers had never moved past that March night. And somewhere in the silence, without realizing it, Duluth began forgetting. By the early 1980s, the city of Duluth had done what people often do when pain becomes too heavy to carry. It learned to step around it. New families moved into the neighborhood where Hannah once walked home from the cafe. Children played on the sidewalks without knowing the shadow that hung over that stretch of Superior Street. Teenagers gathered near the lake at night, laughing the way Hannah once did, unaware of the danger that had stolen her future. Stores changed signs, roads were repaved, houses were renovated. Time repainted the city, but it never touched the ache inside Miriam. Every now and then, someone would mention Hannah in passing. A teacher would recall her drawings. A neighbor would remember her kindness. A church member would bring up her smile during a quiet conversation. But those moments were brief, soft acknowledgments that faded faster than they came. People were afraid to speak too long about tragedy, as if acknowledging it might somehow bring it back. The city did what cities do best. It buried the hard memories under new stories. But Miriam saw everything the town tried to forget. She noticed when the old cafe remodeled. She noticed when the bus stop sign was replaced. She noticed when the patch of sidewalk where Hannah's notebook was found was torn up during construction. Each change felt like the world erasing her daughter one small piece at a time. She wrote to local reporters. She called radio stations. She sent handwritten letters to city offices begging them to revisit the case. Most replies were polite. Some were dismissive, and many never came at all. By the late 1980s, Hannah wasn't a headline. She wasn't even a memory shared outside of her home. The years had pushed her story into the cracks of small-town consciousness. But in Miriam's heart, nothing faded. The silence around the case wasn't just painful, it was a second loss. First her daughter, then the world's willingness to remember her. By the 1990s, Hannah Cooper's name had shifted from memory to myth. People didn't speak about her as a daughter anymore. They spoke about her as a story. Teenagers whispered that if you walked past Superior Street after midnight, you could feel a cold rush of wind that wasn't weather. Some claimed they saw a figure near the old bus stop, a girl with a scarf blowing behind her. None of it was real, yet the town clung to these tales because stories were easier to handle than truth. Truth demanded action. Folklore demanded nothing. Parents warned their children not to linger outside after dark. They didn't mention Hannah directly, but the meaning was clear. Go straight home. Stick with friends. Don't trust empty streets. Everyone knew what those warnings referred to, but no one said her name. Not at city council meetings, not at neighborhood gatherings, not at church. Hannah had become a cautionary tale instead of a person, and that was the cruelest part. Folklore preserved the outline of her tragedy, but erased who she was. Gone was the girl who sketched her dreams in the margins of school notebooks. Gone was the teenager who stayed after her cafe shift to help coworkers close. Gone was the daughter who hugged her mother before leaving the house every morning. Instead, she became the girl at Superior Street, a story used to scare kids into behaving. Meanwhile, Miriam heard every rumor. Neighbors pretended they didn't see her Stetson when someone mentioned that street. People lowered their voices when she walked into a room. It wasn't cruelty, it was avoidance. But avoidance burns just as deep. She sometimes stood on Superior Street at night, long coat pulled tight, breathing the cold air the same way she imagined Hannah must have on that final walk. She whispered her daughter's name into the quiet, trying to claim back what the town had rewritten. No one else heard her, no one else tried. Folklore carried Hannah's shadow, but only Miriam carried her truth. As the years dragged forward, the Cooper household grew quieter in ways people don't talk about. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that settles into the walls and refuses to leave. Hannah's father, Leonard, carried the loss like a stone tied to his chest. He stopped listening to the radio. He stopped working late shifts. He stopped laughing at the jokes he used to tell at every family gathering. Grief didn't change him overnight. It wore him down inch by inch until the man who once filled rooms with his voice now barely spoke at all. He would sit at the kitchen table long after midnight, shoulders slumped, staring at the door as though willing it to open. Miriam watched him from the hallway, helpless. There are no words for watching hope die inside the person you love. By 1982, Leonard's body began failing. Doctors said stress. Miriam said heartbreak. She was the one who found him slumped over that same kitchen table one cold morning, hand loosely curled beside a mug of untouched coffee. The chair was still warm. When she called for help, her voice barely rose above a whisper, because part of her already knew she had lost him too. After the funeral, neighbors visited for a week. Casseroles, cards, quiet condolences. But grief has an expiration date in most people's minds, and soon the visits stopped. The food stopped. The calls stopped, and Miriam was left alone in a house filled with someone missing. Her routines changed. She moved more slowly. She spoke less. She learned to cook for one, to shop for one, to sleep on only one side of the bed. But she kept every one of Hannah's belongings exactly where they had been left. The notebook from class, the scarf she used to wrap twice around her neck, the half-finished painting leaning against the wall. Some nights, Miriam sat on her daughter's bed and pressed her forehead to the pillow, hoping to remember the scent of her hair. It faded, everything fades, except the ache. Town leaders sent her annual letters, lifeless and polite, assuring her the case remained open. But every year, the officer handling it changed. Every year, someone new told her they'd try to take another look. Every year, she received nothing back. Silence became the only thing consistent. Still she waited. Still she called. Still she walked the same blocks Hannah had walked on her last night. People told her she needed to move on, but they never understood what she already knew. You can move houses. You can move buffs. You can move through years. But you never move on from a child who never came home. By the late 1990s, Miriam no longer expected answers. She simply refused to stop asking. And in that refusal, she kept her daughter alive. By the early 2000s, Duluth looked nothing like the town Hannah had once known. Coffee shops replaced hardware stores. New families filled the neighborhoods. Teenagers walked Superior Street without ever hearing her name. The world kept moving, loud and bright, as if history could be paved over with fresh sidewalks and neon lights. But every time a building changed or a road was widened, Miriam felt the loss sharpen, because each new layer of fresh paint seemed to erase another piece of her daughter's memory. People stopped mentioning Hannah altogether. Not out of cruelty, out of discomfort. Tragedy makes people look away, and this town had been looking away for decades. The old diner where Hannah worked closed down in '89. The bus stop where her scarf was found was replaced with a metal shelter that held no trace of what happened there. Even the field where the search parties once gathered had become a parking lot. Strangers parked their cars on the very ground where Miriam once fell to her knees begging God to return her child. None of them knew. None of them cared. Why would they? The past wasn't theirs to hold, but Miriam held it every day. She still visited the old diner lot, even though it was just cracked pavement and weeds now. She stood there quietly, tracing the air as if touching the outline of her daughter's last steps. Sometimes she whispered, "I'm still here. Sweetheart, I haven't gone anywhere." The town's silence began to feel intentional, like everyone had agreed to forget because remembering required courage they didn't have. Police leadership changed, officers retired. Young recruits walked into the precinct having never even heard the name Hannah Cooper. To them, she was a line in an old binder, gathering dust on a shelf no one touched. But to Miriam, she was a heartbeat that never stopped echoing. The only reminders left were the ones Miriam built by force of will, the handwritten flyers she still printed every March, the candles she set on her front steps, and the framed photo she placed in her window so every passerby would see the girl who once brought light into the world. Some neighbors avoided her gaze, too ashamed to admit they no longer remembered the details of the story that once shook their town. Others gave her small nods of sympathy, the kind of nods people give when they want to help but don't know how. But none of them truly understood what it meant to wake up every morning in a house that used to hold laughter and now held only echoes. The hardest part wasn't the waiting, it wasn't the loneliness, it wasn't even the grief. The hardest part was knowing the town had moved on while her daughter's truth sat frozen in time. Miriam stayed loyal to a memory everyone else had let slip through their fingers, because forgetting was easy. Remembering was the only thing that kept Hannah alive. Deep in the Duluth Police Department basement, past the flickering bulbs and metal shelves that carried the weight of forgotten stories, sat a single cardboard box with a faded label, Cooper, Hannah, 1974. No one checked on it. No one moved it. Most days, no one even saw it. It blended into the background like a piece of old furniture. Harmless, unnoticed, untouched. Dust settled so thick across the lid that it looked like it had grown a second skin. The tape holding it shut had dried and cracked, the edges curling like old paper left too long in the sun. Inside that box lay the last pieces of a life cut short: her torn scarf, the notebook page recovered from the street, the sweater fiber that once held warmth, and a police report that read more like a rough guess than an investigation. But none of it mattered, because no one had opened it since the mid-70s. Every new detective who passed through that basement saw rows of identical boxes and assumed the past was too cold to thaw. They were told to focus on active cases, the ones with fresh interviews, digital footage, and leads that didn't require digging through decades of neglect. A few older officers remembered the Cooper case, but they spoke of it like a ghost story, something whispered, not examined. "Yeah, that one," they'd say with a sigh. Then they'd move on. For almost half a century, that box sat in the dark while the world outside changed. Technology advanced. Forensics evolved. Science grew teeth. But still, no one opened it. Not when missing persons databases were created. Not when DNA mapping transformed criminal investigations. Not when other cold cases in the region were revisited. Not even when Miriam begged the department, year after year, to reinvestigate. Some officers promised they would take a look. None of them did. If the box had a voice, it would have been screaming. But boxes don't scream. They just wait and hope someone finally cares enough to lift the lid. By the late 2010s, the handwriting on the label had nearly vanished, faded by time until it was barely legible. To anyone walking through that basement, it looked like nothing more than another old file in a sea of forgotten tragedies. But the truth was simple. The answers were there. They always had been. The town didn't need a miracle. It needed someone to open the box. And for 46 years, no one did. Not until 2020. That year, a statewide initiative forced departments across Minnesota to review long-abandoned cases. A cold case team was formed. Binders were pulled from shelves. Boxes were hauled up from basements. And for the first time since 1974, a gloved hand reached for the box labeled Cooper, Hannah. The seal cracked, the dust lifted, and the past finally inhaled. The silence that had suffocated the case for decades began to shift. Not loudly, but unmistakably. Because a story isn't dead as long as someone is willing to reopen it. When the Minnesota Cold Case Initiative launched in early 2020, most departments treated it like another bureaucratic project. A checklist, a formality, something to satisfy state leadership. But for Detective Nora Ellingson, newly transferred from to Minneapolis, it was personal. She'd grown up hearing whispers about the girl who vanished near Superior Street, a story older adults mentioned with lowered voices, the one that made kids walk faster when the streetlights flickered at night. She remembered her grandmother locking the door twice whenever Hannah Cooper's name came up, like the fear itself was still alive. So when Nora saw the cracked evidence box with Hannah's faded label, she didn't walk past it. She froze. She stared at it the way someone stares at a photograph from a dream. Familiar, unsettling, calling her closer. Something in her chest tightened, the kind of instinct that doesn't explain itself but refuses to be ignored. She pulled it from the shelf, dust blooming into the air like disturbed memories. For a long moment, she didn't open it. She just held it. A simple cardboard box carrying 46 years of unanswered questions, 46 years of a mother's unwavering vigil and a town's willful silence. The room around her buzzed with officers chatting casually, joking, making coffee. None of them noticed her standing still with the weight of an entire life in her hands. They'd walked past that box 100 times. But Nora hadn't lived through the era that abandoned Hannah. She belonged to the era that refused to let silence win. She set the box gently on the metal table, snapped on her gloves, and broke the seal for the first time since Gerald Ford was president. Inside lay the story the town had buried: Hannah's torn scarf, fibers from her sleeve, a fingerprint card incomplete and smudged. Witness notes scribbled by tired officers who never imagined DNA would one day reshape the world. A fragment of metal that had been dismissed as irrelevant. Every piece felt like a heartbeat returning after years of stillness. Nora read Hannah's name aloud, not for procedure, but because saying it made her feel responsible for it. For the first time in decades, someone looked at the evidence not as relics, but as puzzle pieces waiting for the right hands. She whispered under her breath, "We're going to find you." In that dim basement room, it wasn't just a promise. It was a spark, one that would burn through lies, through decades of negligence, through the quiet myths Duluth had built to soothe itself. And in that single moment, Hannah Cooper's case, once frozen in fear and forgotten in storage, began to rise. Not because of luck, not because of fate, but because someone finally cared enough to turn on the light. Word of Nora Ellingson's decision to re-examine the Cooper case spread through the department, slower than gossip, but faster than approval. Most officers shrugged when they heard. A few muttered, "Good luck with that fossil." Others wondered why a fresh detective would choose the one case that had defeated everyone before her. But Nora didn't care about their doubts. The moment she submitted her request to have the evidence pre-screened for modern forensic viability, something shifted. Not in the building, not even in the case file, but in the air around the story itself. It was as if Hannah's name had been waiting for decades to be spoken with intention instead of pity. That morning, Nora carried the evidence box upstairs, past curious glances, past officers who didn't know the weight of what she held. She submitted it to the new forensic queue, a digital form replacing paperwork that had once piled up like forgotten graves. For the first time since 1974, Hannah's case received a timestamp, 05:17 p.m. Evidence submitted for advance review, a small action on a screen, a massive crack in 46 years of silence. When the supervisor initialed the request, Nora exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding. This wasn't just procedure, it was permission. It meant the case was no longer sleeping in a basement. It was officially active, officially recognized, officially worth fighting for. Miriam Cooper had spent nearly 50 years begging someone, anyone, to care. Now, finally, someone did. Nora walked back to her desk, sat down slowly, and reread every witness statement from 1974. She studied the contradictions, the inconsistencies, the shortcuts taken when fear outweighed patience. She circled missing timestamps, flagged interviews that lacked follow-up, and highlighted the statements that suddenly felt more suspicious than they had on fragile paper. This wasn't nostalgia. This was reconstruction. By the end of her shift, she had outlined a plan. Reanalyze every physical item using modern tools. Cross-check all male residents within a quarter-mile radius of the 1974 bus stop. Identify every witness still alive. Remap Superior Street as it existed in '74. Request genetic genealogy access through the state partnership. But the moment that sealed the shift, the moment that proved the case had truly reopened, happened when a young intern approached Nora with a clipboard. "Detective Ellingson, your request was moved to priority review. They said the age of the case qualifies it." Nora froze again, just like she had in the basement. Priority review wasn't standard. It meant they believed the case was solvable. It meant they believed the evidence still carried a voice. She whispered, "Thank you," though the intern had already walked away. For the rest of the evening, she stayed late, writing the first modern summary of the Hannah Cooper disappearance. Her fingers moved with urgency, almost instinctively, as if she were completing something that had lingered unfinished for far too long. At 11:02 p.m., she typed the final line, "Case reactivated. Evidence suggests missed connections. Further analysis required immediately." And as she closed her laptop, the world outside was covered in snow. Quiet, cold, and heavy. But tonight, Duluth's silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of forgetting. It was the silence before truth rises. The next morning, Nora stepped into the station with the same determination she'd carried the night before. But this time, the room felt different. Officers who had barely glanced at her earlier now watched her walk past, curious about why the dusty Cooper case had suddenly resurfaced in department chatter. At 8:14 a.m., her phone buzzed. Forensics lab. Preliminary review complete. Nora's pulse jumped. 46 years of inaction. 46 years of excuse. 46 years of a mother waiting at a window. And now, finally, there was motion. She tapped the notification and opened the report. Only 3 words were highlighted in yellow: viable biological material. She sat upright, breath caught in her chest. This wasn't a miracle. It was evidence the original investigators had missed, misplaced, or misunderstood. A tiny fragment trapped in the fibers of Hannah's scarf, a microscopic trace that modern science could amplify into a profile. For the first time since 1974, this case had a path forward. Nora stood, grabbed her coat, and walked straight to the forensics unit. The lab tech, a woman named Brianna with tired eyes and coffee-stained sleeves, greeted her with a cautious smile. "We checked the scarf twice," Brianna said, holding the evidence tray with surprising care. "There's material under the weave, old, but preserved better than we expected." Nora swallowed hard. "Is it enough?" "It could be, Brianna answered. "If the sample cooperates, it's fragile, but it's real." Real. The first real sign that Hannah hadn't vanished into nothing, that her final moments had left a trace someone could finally read. Nora leaned closer. "Start extraction immediately." Brianna nodded, but her face grew serious. "It'll take time, days, maybe weeks, but we'll do everything we can." It wasn't a promise, it was a lifeline. As Nora walked back toward her desk, she noticed something surprising. The precinct felt more attentive. Officers paused their conversations as she passed. Detectives glanced at the Cooper file on her table. In a place where cases came and went, Hannah's name was suddenly spoken again, and for reasons none of them would admit. It made the entire building sit a little straighter. When Nora sat down, she opened her notebook and wrote a sentence she never expected to write. "For the first time, there is hope." She circled the word hope twice, not because she needed the emphasis, but because she knew Miriam Cooper had spent almost 50 years begging for it. Nora planned to visit her soon, but not yet. She refused to knock on that door without something concrete, something worthy of reopening a wound that never truly healed. A quiet knock pulled her from her thoughts. It was Officer Lyle Harper, young, eager, and barely a year into the job. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Detective Ellingson, is it true? The Cooper case? It's moving?" Nora nodded. "A small start, but yes." He shifted awkwardly, then said, "My grandmother used to talk about her. About how the whole neighborhood changed after she disappeared. People still remember, even if they pretend they don't." For a moment, Nora saw something she hadn't expected. A generation that inherited fear they'd never personally lived through. Hannah's absence had outlasted entire families. "Thank you, Harper," Nora said quietly. "That means more than you realize." He gave a nod and walked away, leaving Nora alone with the hum of the station and the weight of a beginning. A beginning that had taken nearly half a century to reach. She looked at the evidence box one last time before turning back to her case map on the wall. Superior Street, the bus stop, the cafe, the narrow road home Hannah never finished. For the first time, those faded lines didn't feel like a grave. They felt like a trail. A trail she intended to follow until the end. Word travels fast in a quiet town, even when no one admits to listening. By the next afternoon, whispers drifted through Duluth like a cold draft under every door. People didn't say Hannah's name outright, not yet, but conversations shifted when someone mentioned the police station. Old neighbors lingered a little longer on their porches, pretending to sweep snow that didn't need sweeping. Shop owners paused mid-sentence when customers asked, "Did you hear something's happening with that old case?" No one wanted to be wrong. No one wanted to be right. At Thompson's grocery, 2 women spoke softly while comparing prices on canned soup. "They reopened it," one murmured. "After all these years? Something must have changed, something important." Across town, a retired bus driver sat by his window staring at Superior Street, the same route Hannah once walked. He rubbed his hands together, uneasy. "Should have told them more," he whispered to himself. "Should have insisted." But regret never rewound anything. It only replayed the same moment louder. In a small cafe near Lake Avenue, a college student overheard 2 older men arguing over their morning muffins. Why bring up the past now? One grumbled. Because it never stopped mattering, the other replied. The second man's voice cracked slightly, the kind of fracture that comes from a memory pressed down for too long. Meanwhile, at the senior community center, someone taped a yellowed missing poster copy near the bulletin board. The edges curled upward, the ink faded, but the message was clear. People remembered, even when they pretended not to. Yet the most profound reaction came from the people who never spoke at all. Those who lived through 1974 felt a shift they recognized immediately. The same tightness in their chests they felt the night Hannah disappeared. The same unease. The same sense that the air had changed without warning. Some people locked their doors earlier than usual. Some walked faster to their cars. Some stood in their living rooms staring at the old neighborhood, convinced the past had stepped forward again. And yet, under all that fear, something else stirred. Relief, not joy, not celebration. Just relief that someone, finally, after decades, they had picked up the thread everyone else dropped. It was small, it was fragile, but it was unmistakable. Hope had returned to Duluth, even if people didn't dare speak it too loudly. And for the first time in 46 years, Hannah Cooper's name moved through the town with weight. The kind that makes people stop what they're doing and listen. Because deep down, everyone knew the same truth. Silence may last a lifetime, but guilt never disappears. And if Nora Ellingson was waking this ghost, then Duluth knew one thing for sure. Something was coming. Before Nora even finalized her report, before anyone confirmed anything official, something inside Miriam changed. The kind of instinct only a mother carries, even after decades of unanswered nights. She felt it the moment she opened her eyes that morning. No dream woke her, no noise startled her, no call came through her silent phone. Yet something was different. She sat up slowly in her small living room chair, the one she slept in more often than her bed, and watched the quiet street beyond her window. Superior Street looked exactly the same, still gray, indifferent. But Miriam felt movement in the stillness, like an old wound sensing weather before the storm. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the porch light switch, even though it was already off. She didn't turn it on again. She just touched it, the way some people touch headstones to feel close to the ones they lost. Then she whispered, barely audible, "Something's coming, Hannah." She didn't know why she said it. She didn't question it either. All morning she moved through her home with a restless energy she couldn't explain. She polished the picture frame holding Hannah's final school portrait. She refolded the same blanket 3 times. She brewed a pot of coffee she didn't drink. Nothing in her world had changed. No new letter, no new call, no knock at the door. Yet she felt the shift as clearly as a change in the wind. When she stepped onto her porch to collect the mail, neighbors noticed her standing a little taller than usual. One even asked, "You all right, Miriam?" She nodded, though her voice didn't match her certainty. "I don't know, I just feel something." The neighbor didn't know what to say. No one ever did, but the truth was simple. Her heart had learned the language of waiting, and today that language carried a different rhythm. A rhythm that sounded like motion. A rhythm that echoed like footsteps approaching after a long, empty silence. Inside the house, she placed the mail on the counter, untouched. Then she returned to the living room window, her lighthouse, her lookout, her burden, and sat again, hands resting in her lap, eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't know Nora existed. She didn't know the cold case unit was running new tests. She didn't know Hannah's evidence box had been opened for the first time in nearly half a century. But she felt it. Mothers always do. And for the first time in 46 years, Miriam didn't feel alone in the search. She didn't know the truth yet, but she could sense it moving. By late 2020, Miriam Cooper was 84 years old and moved more slowly than she used to, but her routine never changed. Every morning she walked to the edge of the porch, rested her hand on the railing, and looked toward the same stretch of Superior Street her daughter vanished from. Even the neighbors who once tried to comfort her had grown old, moved, or passed on. Whole generations in Duluth lived their lives without knowing Hannah's name, but Miriam carried it like a heartbeat. Winter pressed harder that year. Snow piled high against her steps, and the cold stung her joints like needles. But still she stood outside, waiting for a truth the world seemed determined to forget. Cafes changed, buildings were replaced, streets were widened. But the silence around Hannah's case stayed heavy and unchanged, like a shadow frozen in place. Some nights, Miriam sat by the window wrapped in the same knitted shawl she wore the week Hannah disappeared. She whispered her daughter's name into the quiet house, letting it linger in the air as if speaking it kept the girl alive in some unseen way. She didn't expect miracles anymore. She only wanted acknowledgement, a sign that someone besides her still cared, still remembered, still searched. Each year, she mailed a letter to the police department, even though she already knew the answer before they sent it. No updates. Case still open. She would hold the paper for a long moment before folding it gently and setting it inside the drawer where every other letter from the past 46 years rested, a stack of promises that went nowhere. But on the first Sunday of December 20, something subtle shifted. When Miriam opened her door that morning, there was no letter, no notification, no knock, but her porch light, the one that had burned for nearly half a century, flickered for the first time in decades. Just once, a brief tremble of the bulb, as though the past itself had stirred. She stepped closer, placed her fingertips against the guas, and breathed out a trembling exhale. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't try to explain it. She just whispered, "It's time, isn't it?" Inside the police department, across town, the cold case unit had quietly begun digitizing old evidence, including a box marked Cooper, H, a box that hadn't been touched in almost 50 years. Miriam didn't know that, but her heart did. The silence she'd lived with for nearly half a century was starting to tremble, not enough to be noticed by the rest of Duluth, but enough for a mother who had lived every single day in the aftermath of a missing child. And so, as winter closed in, she did what she had always done. She turned the porch light back on. For Hannah. For hope. For the truth that had been buried too long. This time, the light didn't just glow. It waited. By early 2021, Minnesota had begun rebuilding its approach to long-ignored crimes. Across the state, families kept reaching out, begging for someone to revisit cases buried by time. The pressure finally broke through. A new cold case unit was created, smaller than it should have been, underfunded in all the predictable ways, but filled with people who refused to accept silence as an answer. Detective Lena Marquez was one of them. She had transferred from St. Paul after years of working missing person cases where families begged for justice that never arrived. She was younger than most detectives, sharp-eyed, relentless, and known for refusing to let paperwork tell her what was hopeless. When the new unit handed her the stack labeled 1974, Cooper, Hannah, the room went quiet. Most detectives didn't recognize the name, but Lena did. She had grown up hearing fragments of the story, neighborhood whispers, an old woman still keeping a porch light on, a girl everyone once trusted to brighten the room and then vanished without a trace. She remembered walking past Superior Street on field trips, sensing an ache in the air even as a child. Now she held the case file in her hands. She didn't see a stack of faded documents. She saw a mother who waited 46 years. The moment she opened the box, a thin cloud of dust lifted, as if time itself had been disturbed. Inside were the items no one had touched since the original detectives retired. The torn scarf, the notebook Hannah carried everywhere, a small envelope containing nail scrapings, and a sealed vial with a single hair trapped inside. Lena whispered to herself, almost as a vow, "Let's see what they missed." It wasn't confidence. It was responsibility. The kind you inherit the moment you open a door no one dared touch. Outside, the winter sky pressed against the department windows, gray and heavy. Inside, for the first time in decades, Hannah Cooper's name sat under a new heading, Active Review. The past wasn't just stirring, it was preparing to speak. Detective Lena Marquez didn't waste a second. The moment the Cooper box was logged into the system, she carried every sealed item to the forensic wing, a place where old cases either died quietly or rose again. She pushed for the latter. Most labs would have dismissed material this old, but Minnesota's cold case unit had one advantage the original investigators never imagined: FGGS, forensic genome sequencing, a technology that didn't care about decades, humidity, or the mistakes of past detectives. It only cared about truth. The technician stared at the items spread out on the steel table. Hannah's torn scarf, the hair sealed in glass, the scrapings taken from beneath her nails the night she disappeared. These samples are older than half the people working here, he muttered. Lena didn't smile. She said only one thing. Do it anyway. The technician nodded, understanding without needing the explanation. Cases like Hannah's weren't just files, they were open wounds. And wounds this deep demanded answers. The scar fibers were processed first. Even after 46 years, they held microscopic traces of contact. Particles that once meant nothing, now potentially everything. Next came the nail scrapings. The DNA was faint, nearly ghost-like, but the new machines were designed for exactly that kind of challenge. Hours turned into a full day. Lena stayed, pacing the length of the lab windows, her notes spread across the counter. Timelines, old witness statements, places where the original detectives had simply guessed instead of proven. She reread Miriam Cooper's earliest statements, each one filled with pain, sharpened into clarity. She wouldn't leave. Someone took her. By evening, the first alert flashed across the lab monitor. DNA extracted, partial male profile. Lena froze. It wasn't complete, but it was enough. Enough for the one tool that had rewritten cold case history across the country, genetic genealogy. This wasn't just science. This was resurrection. She uploaded the profile into the genealogical system, the modern database connecting millions of ordinary people to the crimes their families never knew existed. The process took hours, branching out cousins, matches, distant relatives, creating a web that stretched across states. At 2:17 a.m., a single match appeared. Not a direct offender. A relative. A surname she didn't expect. A surname that hadn't appeared anywhere in the original 1974 investigation. Rowan. Lena leaned forward, whispering to the empty room. Who were you? And how did you get close enough to her? For the first time since Hannah Cooper vanished, the case had a pulse. Detective Lena Marquez stared at the Rowan match glowing on her screen, the name sitting there like a challenge the past had never answered. She clicked through the branches one by one, sons, cousins, uncles, marriages that stretched from Minnesota to Wisconsin, all of them pieces of a puzzle no one in 1974 had bothered to finish. The deeper she traced, the clearer the pattern became. The Rowan family had lived around Duluth for decades. Factory workers, truck drivers, ordinary men with ordinary routines. Nothing about them stood out enough to be remembered, and that was the part that chilled her most. Someone who blended in that well could take a life and vanish back into routine without anyone noticing the shift. Exactly what happened to Hannah. One branch of the Rowan tree held a cluster of names Lena studied longer than the rest. The line of Walter Rowan, a former janitor who worked near the bus station where Hannah disappeared. He had died in the late 80s, but two of his sons were still alive. One stayed in Superior, the other remained in Duluth, living in the same neighborhood where Hannah once walked home. Lena printed the lineup, her breath tight. For the first time in nearly half a century, Hannah's case wasn't just memory. It had direction. It had shape. It had possibility. She gathered the evidence tags, sealed the files, and walked them to her supervisor's office. Her voice shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. I have a match, she said, a real one. Her supervisor leaned back, stunned. After 46 years? Lena nodded. We're not done, not yet. That night, she locked her office, stepped into the cold Duluth air, and paused on the steps of the station. The wind cut across her face, the same kind of wind Hannah Cooper walked through on her last night alive. Lena whispered to the darkness, I heard you, Hannah. I'm not stopping now. Tomorrow, the Rowan family would be placed under surveillance. Tomorrow, one man's world would start to crumble. Tomorrow, the truth would finally begin to surface. Detective Lena Marquez worked through the Rowan genealogy like she was peeling back layers of a story no one wanted told. Every branch, every connection, every birth and marriage record brought her closer to the truth. What began as a vague match had tightened into something sharp, a tree with only two living men who could fit the profile. Henry Rowan, Thomas Rowan, brothers, both in their 70s, both longtime Duluth residents, both with clean reputations that had never been questioned. The realization hit her with a force she didn't expect. Whoever took Hannah had lived his entire life surrounded by neighbors who trusted him, children who waved at him, churches that welcomed him. A man who aged quietly while the family he shattered never healed. Lena laid both profiles side by side on the conference table. Henry, former maintenance worker at a chemical processing plant. Thomas, retired bus driver. Two ordinary men, two ordinary lives. But only one of them left a signature on Hannah's scarf in 1974. She read the chemical report again, a trace compound embedded in the fabric, common in industrial cleaning solutions used in the plant where Henry once worked. The detail had been invisible in the 70s. Not anymore. Her chest tightened. Henry Rowan wasn't just a name on a list. He was a possibility sharpened into a threat. Lena exhaled, steadying herself. This wasn't a guess. This was alignment. Science, history, location, and time all pointing in the same direction. Still, she needed one more thing. Modern truth. A clean DNA sample. The surveillance team moved into place that afternoon, watching Henry's small house on East 8th Street. He lived alone now, tending his yard, waving to neighbors, feeding stray cats. The kind of man people described as harmless. But harmless men don't leave traces on missing girls. When Henry carried his trash bin to the curb, Lena felt her pulse jump. The team moved in the moment he went back inside. They lifted a used coffee cup, sealed it, tagged it, and rushed it to the lab. The wait for results felt like days, even though the lab needed only hours. When the match finally appeared on the monitor, it wasn't subtle. It was exact. A perfect hit. Henry Rowan's DNA was the same male profile recovered from Hannah Cooper's scarf nearly 50 years earlier. Lena didn't speak for several seconds. She just stared at the result, her jaw tightening, her breath locked in her chest. The room felt heavier. The air felt colder. A truth buried for almost half a century had crawled to the surface. When Detective Lena Marquez knocked on Miriam Cooper's door, the old woman didn't rise from her chair right away. Age had slowed her, but grief had carved something deeper. A stillness that only decades of unanswered questions can create. Miriam finally opened the door, her eyes searching Lena's face the way a mother searches the horizon after losing a child. Lena swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. This wasn't just a notification. This was the end of an era. One built on hope, denial, and pain. Miriam, we found a match, Lena said softly. The air shifted. That porch light, the same one Miriam had kept burning since 1974, flickered against her lined face. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Who? Her voice cracked on a single syllable. Lena hesitated, because the truth wasn't cruel, it was devastating. Henry Rowan. Miriam sat down slowly, like her body was folding under a truth she'd carried for so long that part of her believed it would never come. She stared at her trembling hands. They weren't reacting to shock. They were reacting to recognition. I knew it, she whispered. Not because she suspected Henry specifically, but because she had always believed the person who took Hannah wasn't a stranger. He used to come by during the searches, Miriam murmured, voice breaking. He asked if we needed help. He stood in my kitchen, drank my coffee, told me he'd keep an eye out. The memory hit her like a second loss. Lena wanted to reach out but held back, letting Miriam stay in control of her moment. The old woman wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, as if embarrassed by the tears she'd earned the right to shed. Why now, she asked. Why after all this time? Lena answered the only way she could, because the evidence finally had a voice strong enough for someone to hear. Miriam nodded slowly, gripping the arm of her chair. She wasn't crying anymore. She was steady, the kind of steady that comes from living through heartbreak long enough to recognize the shape of the truth. So it was him, she whispered again. All those years, he walked free. And my Hannah didn't. There was no anger left in her, only a tired kind of clarity. A lifetime poured into one painful confirmation. The porch light hummed above them, bright, unbroken, unwavering. A light that had burned for a girl lost in the cold, and for a mother who refused to let her disappear. News of the DNA match spread quietly through the department, but Miriam Cooper felt it louder than anyone. While detectives prepared the final paperwork, she sat alone in her living room, clutching Hannah's sketchbook. The last thing her daughter held with joy, not fear. Her fingers traced the worn pages, stopping on a half-finished drawing Hannah had started the week she vanished. A lakeside horizon, soft shading, a hint of a sunrise she never got to see. And then the memories came back, not as comfort, but as warning signs she had missed. She remembered Henry Rowan standing near the search volunteers in 1974, offering tools, carrying flashlights, asking questions that felt helpful at the time. She remembered him coming to the vigils during those early years, bowing his head with everyone else. Whispering condolences she now realized were nothing but performance. He had positioned himself close enough to appear compassionate, yet distant enough to evade suspicion. He had looked her in the eyes more than once. He even told her, "We'll find her. She deserves peace." Now she understood why he said it with such certainty, because he already knew where she was, because he was never searching, he was monitoring. Detective Marquez watched Miriam relive those memories and felt something shift inside her. Cold cases weren't just puzzles. They were unfinished chapters of people's lives. And today, one of those chapters finally found his missing line. "We're getting close," Lena said gently. "This time, we're not letting him walk away." Miriam nodded, wiping her eyes but keeping her voice steady. "For Hannah," she whispered. "End it." Outside, the wind pushed against the old house, rattling loose branches. The same kind of night Hannah disappeared. But this time, the darkness didn't feel unanswered. This time, the truth was finally coming to the door of the man who had escaped it for almost half a century. It happened just after sunrise, on a morning that looked harmless. Light snow covered the rooftops, and Henry Rowan sat alone at his kitchen table, eating toast slowly, the way men his age usually do. His hair was white now, his back slightly bent, his breathing steady. Nothing about him suggested danger. Nothing about him hinted at what he had carried for nearly 50 years. The knock came without warning, sharp, final, nothing like a neighbor stopping by. Henry looked up, confused, crumbs still on his fingers. When he opened the door, he was met with a line of officers and a quiet command that cut straight through the cold air. "Henry Rowan, you're under arrest." He didn't argue, he didn't ask why, he didn't even blink. He simply lowered his head, placed his hands where they told him to, and let them lead him outside like a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind for decades. The neighbors who happened to be awake froze on their porches, watching a man they had trusted for half a lifetime being guided into a squad car. Some whispered, some shook their heads, some stepped back from the curb as if the ground itself had just shifted. Inside the house, the coffee on the table was still warm. The toast was half-eaten, and for the first time in almost 50 years, the silence inside Henry Rowan's home felt like confession. While Henry Rowan sat in the back of the squad car, staring straight ahead, detectives entered his workshop, a small shed behind the house that most neighbors thought was just a place where he repaired fishing gear and sanded old furniture. The door creaked open, and dust in the air caught the morning light like a warning no one noticed for decades. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Shelves of tools, jars of screws, boxes stacked in uneven rows. But the moment Detective Lena Marquez stepped inside, something in her chest tightened. There was an order here that felt forced, as if every object was placed with the hope that no one would move it again. She walked further in. She brushed her gloved hand along a workbench, and that's when she saw it. A small wooden box tucked behind a can of varnish. Too clean, too carefully placed, too out of rhythm with the rest of the clutter. She pulled it forward. The lid opened with a soft click. Inside was a silver pendant, a simple one. Hannah Cooper's initials carved by hand. Detective Marquez froze, not because of the pendant itself, but because it looked polished, recently touched, recently held. As if Henry had opened this box year after year, reliving a moment the rest of the world had tried to forget. Next to the pendant lay a stack of faded Polaroid photos, wrapped with a rubber band that had turned brittle with age. When Marquez slid the first one free, her breath caught. It was Hannah, smiling unaware, captured from a distance. The angles changed, the seasons changed, the clothing changed, But the eyes in the photos never met the lens. Marquez whispered he watched her long before that night. Officers exchanged a look, anger mixed with disbelief. They opened more drawers, more boxes, revealing scraps of fabric, old receipts, and notes written in a shaky hand. Each one added weight to the truth that had lived quietly inside these walls. Outside, neighbors gathered behind caution tape, whispering the same question. How could this be him? But the workshop had already answered. The past wasn't gone. It was stored carefully in boxes, waiting for someone brave enough to open them. When news of Henry Rowan's arrest spread, Duluth felt like it stopped breathing. People stood on porches holding their coffee cups midair. Radios cut into morning shows with breaking bulletins. Phones began ringing in houses that hadn't heard each other's voices in years. By noon, everyone knew the man who waved at children, fixed neighbors' shovels, and handed out candy every Halloween had been living a story the rest of them could never afford to imagine. Some cried, some refused to believe it, some whispered, I knew something was wrong, even though no one ever said it when it mattered. Detective Marquez stepped in front of the cameras that afternoon. Her voice didn't shake, but something in her eyes did. She spoke about the evidence, the decades of delay, the pain of a mother who kept her porch light burning through every winter. She didn't speak of vengeance. She spoke of truth, finally landing where it should have been all along. Behind her, Miriam Cooper stood wrapped in her old coat, staring at the ground as if she were afraid to look up and let herself believe any of this was real. Half the town watched her instead of the officers. A woman who lost her daughter and then spent almost 50 years losing pieces of herself, now faced with the answer she begged for. A truth that hurt, but at least it was a truth she could hold. Families of other missing girls gathered as well. Some clutched flyers so old the ink had faded. Others brought candles. A few simply watched from the edge of the crowd, silently wondering if they had spent their whole lives living near their own answer too. Duluth wasn't angry at the police or the cold case division or the reporters. They were angry at the years, at how easily a man could hide in the same streets he once turned into scars, at how a life could vanish and the world just kept moving forward without looking back. Hannah deserved more than all these winters, one neighbor whispered. And for the first time since 1974, people said her name without lowering their voices. Detective Marquez stepped away from the podium, wiping her cheek quickly before anyone could comment on it. She didn't want applause or recognition. She only wanted one thing, for Hannah Cooper's story to reach a place that pain couldn't erase anymore. The day ended quietly, no cheers, no loud announcements, just a town trying to understand how evil could sit across from them at grocery stores, nod politely in parking lots, and still sleep peacefully every night. The arrest was over, but the reckoning had only begun. When the trial opened in early 2023, Duluth felt colder than usual, not because of winter, but because every person walking toward the courthouse carried a memory of that night in 1974. Some came out of loyalty, some came because they needed answers. Others came because they still couldn't believe the man in the orange jumpsuit was the same neighbor who once fixed their fence or shoveled their driveway. Henry Rowan shuffled into the courtroom, thinner than he'd ever been, age biting at him, but still wearing that same blank expression. No remorse, no recognition, just a man who spent 50 years hiding and now stood where hiding no longer worked. When the judge asked for his plea, Henry didn't look at Miriam. He didn't look at Detective Marquez. He didn't look at anyone. He simply said, I accept the evidence, but I do not recall the events. An offered plea, a way to say I'm not innocent without having to admit I did it. The room tightened. Some gasped. Some shook their heads. Some whispered prayers under their breath. But Miriam Cooper did something no one expected. She didn't flinch. She just stared at the man who stole her daughter and half her life, holding the same strength that had kept her porch light burning for decades. For the first time in half a century, Henry Rowan was forced to sit and listen, truly listen, as the world spoke Hannah's name again. When it came time for victim statements, the courtroom went silent. Even the judge paused before calling the first name, as if the building itself understood what was about to be spoken. Miriam Cooper. She stood slowly, using the rail for balance, but her voice carried with a strength that didn't match her fragile frame. For nearly 50 years, she had been dismissed, overlooked, and told to wait for updates. But today, no one dared look away. She walked toward the podium with a single item in her hand, Hannah's scarf, the one found on the frozen ground the night she vanished. Its fabric was worn, edges frayed, but Miriam held it like it still held her daughter's warmth. When she finally spoke, her words didn't tremble. They cut. "You had your life," she said, staring at Henry. "You built routines. You laughed with friends. You aged. My daughter didn't get to do any of that. You kept living while I kept losing." Not a cry, not a scream, just raw truth delivered in a tone that made the people in the back row wipe their eyes. "You took her future," she continued, voice steady. "But you never took her from me. Not really. I carried her through every year you hoped the world would forget her name." Henry didn't blink. He didn't move. That stillness, that cold indifference, sent a chill through the room deeper than any winter outside. When Miriam stepped back from the microphone, people stood without being asked, not out of applause, but out of respect. A woman who fought through decades of silence had finally been heard. When Miriam returned to her seat, the room felt different. The tension wasn't loud anymore. It was heavy, like every person inside carried a piece of her grief on their shoulders. Even the judge paused before speaking, letting the moment settle into the wood of the benches and the walls that had heard thousands of cases, but nothing quite like this. Detective Lena Marquez kept her eyes on Henry. She had seen suspects crumble, lash out, deny everything. But Henry stayed motionless. No apology, no flicker of regret. Just an old man who had hidden behind time, finally stripped of the protection it once gave him. The judge's voice rose, low and steady. "Henry Rowan, for the murder of Hannah Cooper, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." No cheers, no gasps, just silence. The kind that feels like a wound being stitched closed. Henry didn't react, but Miriam did. She exhaled for the first time in decades. Not relief, not joy, but something softer. A kind of peace that came from knowing the world finally recognized the truth she carried alone for too long. Detective Marquez stepped closer and whispered to her, "You kept her alive long enough for justice to catch up." Miriam nodded, eyes shining. She was worth every year. And for the first time since 1974, the courtroom doors opened to let in something other than sorrow. They let in closure, slow, imperfect, but real. When the courtroom emptied, the hallway filled with reporters, neighbors, and strangers who had followed the case for months. But Miriam didn't stay to speak. She stepped outside into the cool morning air, letting the sunlight rest gently on her face, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to fully feel since Hannah vanished. Detective Marquez joined her quietly. No cameras, no microphones, just two women who had carried the same burden from different points in time. Miriam held the court papers to her chest and said softly, "I thought this day would never come." "It came because you never stopped mushing," Marquez replied. A few feet away, residents gathered in small circles, murmuring about Henry Rowan, the man they once trusted, the man who lived among them for decades without raising suspicion. Some still struggled to believe it. Others looked shaken, questioning how someone so visible could be overlooked for half a century. But none of that mattered to Miriam. She walked toward the steps, paused, and looked across the street. Not at the courthouse, not at the journalists gathering by the curb, but at a distant memory, a younger version of her, waiting at the door for a girl who never arrived. That version of herself finally had an answer. Not a happy ending, not a restored future, but truth, the one thing she begged for all these years. As she descended the steps, Detective Marquez whispered the words that would be repeated across Duluth for weeks. The gavel didn't close her story. It finally let it breathe. And with that, Section 7 comes to a close, leaving only Hannah's legacy waiting to be told. By the summer of 2024, Duluth carried a different kind of quiet. Not the heavy silence of fear, but the steady hush of remembrance. Along the lake walk, where the water rolled against the stones in a slow, calming rhythm, a small memorial garden had been rebuilt in Hannah Cooper's honor. What started decades earlier as a single wooden cross placed by her mother had grown into a living display of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes from people who never even knew her. Every March, residents gathered there. Families, students, retired workers, even hikers passing through, standing shoulder to shoulder as Hannah's name was spoken aloud. Some brought lilies, some brought drawings. Others simply bowed their heads, letting the weight of her story move through them. This was no longer a forgotten case. It had become part of Duluth's heartbeat. Miriam, older now, but still caring of herself with quiet strength, attended every year. She would stand in the front row, close her eyes, and listen as the wind coming off Lake Superior carried whispers of the past. She did not cry anymore, not because the pain had vanished, but because the truth had finally been given a place to rest. Detective Lena Marquez often joined her, standing a respectful step behind, never taking credit for the work that brought the truth forward. She always said the same thing when the people thanked her. "I just followed the road Hannah deserved." That garden, once a lonely marker on a cold shoreline, had grown into a reminder that a community can forget, but it can also learn. A place that once felt haunted now felt sacred. As the years passed, Hannah's name didn't fade. It found new meaning. With donations from residents, former classmates, and even strangers moved by her story, Duluth Community College established the Hannah Cooper Nursing Scholarship. It honored the dream she never got to chase, giving young students a chance to do what she hoped to do: help people heal. Every spring, the scholarship committee placed Hannah's framed photograph at the front of the auditorium. The same picture her mother once kept by the kitchen table, Hannah smiling at the camera, unaware of how much she would one day mean to an entire city. The first recipient cried when her name was called, not because she won money, but because she understood the weight of the story attached to it. From that year on, each award ceremony began with a moment of silence for Hannah. Not a sad silence, but a grateful one. The kind that honors a life that should have been longer and acknowledges a community's duty to protect those who still walk the same streets. For Miriam, watching young students step onto the stage was bittersweet. She would place a hand over her heart and whisper, "This is yours too, sweetheart." And even though she knew Hannah couldn't answer, she could feel a kind of peace settling around her, the kind she had been denied for almost 50 years. Bit by bit, the city began to heal, not by forgetting the past, but by carrying Hannah's name into the future. For decades, Duluth avoided saying Hannah's name out loud. People remembered, but they didn't talk. Pain had turned into silence, and silence had turned into habit. But once the truth came out, once the man responsible was finally taken away in handcuffs, the city found its voice again. Local schools added her story to community safety programs. Teachers spoke honestly about the night she vanished, not to frighten students, but to remind them that every life in their city mattered. Even businesses near the lake walk placed small signs in their windows, in memory of Hannah Cooper, never forgotten. At town meetings, older residents who once stayed quiet finally stepped forward. They shared memories of seeing Hannah sketch at the bus stop, or carrying her books pressed to her chest, or waving as she walked home after her shift. Each story added another layer to the girl Duluth had lost, turning her from a headline into a person again. Detective Marquez attended many of these gatherings, listening as people spoke with the honesty they had buried for too long. She often said nothing, just stood in the back, hands folded, grateful that the truth had given the city permission to feel again. Bit by bit, Duluth moved towards something it had avoided for half a century: acknowledgement. Not the painful kind that tears open old wounds, but the human kind that allows a community to finally breathe after holding its breath for far too long. And with every shared story, Hannah's name grew brighter. No longer the symbol of a vanished girl, but the reminder of what a city must protect. As the year came to an end, Duluth found a quiet way to honor the girl it had failed yet never stopped loving. On the anniversary of her disappearance, families gathered along the lake walk with candles cupped in their hands, flames trembling gently in the cold wind coming off Lake Superior. Some people knew Hannah in life, others only knew her story, but everyone stood together because they understood what her memory had come to represent: the cost of silence and the miracle of truth finally rising after half a century. The city's choir sang softly. Parents held their children close. Neighbors who had once avoided the topic now spoke openly, offering comfort instead of distance. For the first time in decades, The evening didn't feel like a vigil for sorrow alone. It felt like a promise to the future. Detective Marquez placed a single white rose by the plaque bearing Hannah's name. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The quiet around her carried everything: grief, resolve, gratitude, and a new kind of peace. As the candles were lowered toward the water, their reflections shimmered across the lake, drifting like tiny stars. And in that soft glow, it became clear that Hannah's life had never faded. It had taught a city how to listen, how to face hard truths, and how to rebuild its sense of protection with intention rather than assumption. Her story didn't return her. It never could. But it changed Duluth. It changed everyone who carried her memory. And in that transformation, Hannah lived on. As the last candle touched the water, the crowd slowly stepped back, watching each flame drift farther out toward the dark horizon. No one spoke. No one moved. It felt as though the entire city was exhaling the breath it had held for 50 years. Miriam stood near the railing with her hands pressed over her heart. Her hair had long since turned silver, her voice softer now, but her strength, her stubborn, unbreakable strength, was unmistakable. She whispered her daughter's name into the wind, knowing it would carry across the lake the same way it had carried across decades of waiting. Detective Marquez joined her for a moment, offering quiet companionship without forcing conversation. Both women stared ahead, not at what was lost, but at what had finally been found: truth, accountability, and the freedom to remember Hannah without wondering anymore. The lanterns continued gliding across Lake Superior, each one a tribute, each one a reminder that some stories demand to be carried forward, not buried. And so Duluth honored one of its own at last, not with fear, but with clarity, not with silence, but with truth, not with sorrow alone, but with gratitude for a life that refused to disappear. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten, and because she held on, so did justice.